Hello, and welcome to the Appalachian Regional Commission's training video on creating the budget for your project. There are different requirements for the budget for construction projects and non-construction projects. For construction projects, the first thing you need is the standard form, or SF for short, 424C form. The numbers on this form must be consistent with the numbers on your SF 424, cost estimate or preliminary engineering report, PER, the narrative, your basic agency letter, and match commitment letters. The second thing you need for construction projects is a cost estimate. For example, a PER or an architectural equivalent. This is preferred for complex projects. This document is a requirement in some ARC states during state level application processes or is required by certain basic agencies. So please double check with contacts at both the ARC state office and the basic agency on whether they require a PER. Cost estimates must include a seal. The third thing you need for construction projects is a budget narrative. This should elaborate on the cost estimate and explain how the costs align with the project scope. For non-construction projects, the first thing you need is the SF424A form. The figures on this form must be consistent with your SF424, your budget narrative, and match commitment letters. The second thing you need is a budget narrative that breaks down costs by line item with a detailed explanation of expenditures and how they align with the project scope. Now let's take a look at each of these components I just mentioned that are required for construction projects. This is the SF424C, the budget form for construction projects. You only need to enter data into columns A and C, total costs and total allowable costs. The total for the project will be in row 16C. Enter the percentage of the total project cost funded by ARC, which will auto-calculate the total amount requested of ARC. You may need to add additional decimal places to the percentage to get at the exact ARC amount you're requesting. Grantees must incur engineering and administrative costs according to federal regulations. Contingencies, which is line item 13, are expected to be between 10 and 30% of total project costs and need to be accounted for in times of supply chain disruptions. Here we have the table of contents and cost estimate sections of a PER, a preliminary engineering report, that was submitted with the project proposal. This shows the cost breakdown of the line items in the SF424C. The document was 29 pages long in total. You can see in the table of contents the typical components contained in a PER, which in general provides a cost estimate for a particular construction project. Some key takeaways for construction project cost estimates. First, cost estimates need to have a credible source. This can be indicated by an engineer's seal or being on an engineer's letterhead. Second, a reasonable reviewer needs to be able to understand the components in the estimate and if they're priced reasonably. Third, cost estimates need to include contingency. Fourth, if the cost estimate does not include lines for administrative, legal, or other costs outside an engineer's scope, they must be included in a detailed budget narrative. PERs are highly encouraged and contents vary by project type. Just another quick reminder here that this document may be required by your ARC state office or basic agency. A good PER provides the foundation for the project description, strategic rationale, and performance measures. Now let's move on to look at non-construction budget components. Here's the SF424A form, the non-construction budget form. The form has 3 pages. We will go through each of them. First is section A, the first page. The grant program on the left-hand side is ARC. Federal or ARC and non-federal or match funds should be entered in the new or revised budget columns. Then put the total budget. There's no need to separate anything out here besides ARC and match. Now let's look at page 2, section B of the form. This breaks down the ARC, match, and total funds by line item. Please put ARC only in the first column, all match in the second column, and calculate the total in the last column. These expenses must align with the scope of project activities. So, if there's a line item that appears here, it needs to be explained in the narrative where you describe the project and vice versa. Please ensure that your project costs are consistent across the standard forms and budget narrative, and please round to whole dollars. Do not use cents. If you're including indirect costs, you must include this in your budget forms that you submit. This is the final page of the SF424A form, Section C and D. In Section C, list any matching funds you have to contribute. As shown here, you can divide out by each match source and put them in applicant, state, other, and then total. Section D is optional, but you can put the ARC amount and the match amount required for the first year of the project and then broken out by quarters. Similarly, for Section E, you can put ARC funding needs per year for each year of the grant. In Section F, if including indirect costs or other costs, explain them and identify your indirect cost rate or that you're using the de minimis rate. Here are some common issues that we see with budget forms and how to address them. On the SF424A, break out ARC funds and match into separate columns in Section B. Second, place subawards under contractual in Section B. If including these, indicate this in your budget narrative contractual section. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Finally, all your match sources need to be listed in Section C. For the SF424C, don't lump everything into construction. Separate the amount into line items if applicable. Grantees often experience difficulty with line 17. To get at the right total amount requested of ARC, you may have to work a bit with the percentage in line 17. Don't get frustrated. Here are two QR codes that will take you to all the forms needed for construction projects and for non-construction projects. Now let's take a look at the budget narrative template for non-construction projects. You can see that we have all the line items from the SF424A here, but this is where you provide more detail on the calculation of those items. The columns are broken down by ARC, cost share or match from cash, cost share or match from in-kind, and total. We're looking at the personnel section, where if including those costs, you would show the time and effort calculation for each person and provide a calculation of benefits if including. Moving down the form, the line items of travel, equipment, and supplies are here in front of you. For travel, we require a mileage rate, per diem, accommodation, meals, transportation costs, for example, flights, and etc., in the breakdown of this line item. Next, we have equipment and supplies. The difference between these two categories is that equipment is anything that costs at or more than $10,000 per unit. Supplies is anything that costs less than $10,000 per unit. So you can group those two categories of costs, but we do require a breakdown of price times quantity of each item. Because of this requirement to have a breakdown of price times quantity, please create a separate supply or equipment list that shows the price times quantity and then total of all supplies or equipment. You can see an example of such a list here. Doing this is especially helpful if the supplies list is very long. Moving down the budget narrative form here, we have contractual and other line items. In contractual can go any items that you're contracting out with another entity. Other is any other expenses that don't fit the other budget categories and need to be described in detail here. Then we have indirect charges, which I'll talk about in a second. Let's talk for a moment about the difference between subrecipients and contractors, both of which go in the contractual line item, but which have different federal regulations around them. Subrecipients may determine who's eligible for the program, for example, to participate in your grant activities. They're responsible for programmatic decision making. Their performance measures will be related to whether the grant objectives were met. They use funds to carry out a program for a public purpose rather than providing goods and services. And importantly, they're responsible for adherence to federal program compliance requirements. Contractors, on the other hand, provide goods and services within their normal business operations, provide similar goods and services to other purchasers, and operate in a competitive environment, provide goods and services that are ancillary to the operation of the federal program and are not subject to the federal program's compliance requirements, although similar requirements may apply for other reasons. We're now at the end of the budget narrative form where we have the indirect cost rate calculator that you can use if you are applying indirect costs to your project to determine how much you're able to charge to this line item. Here you can see the applicable line items that inform the modified total direct cost, or MTDC, a percentage of which is the maximum allowable indirect cost rate. I'll explain more about this in a second. Generally, indirect costs are those not related to the project directly, but are necessary for general operations. For example, rent, utilities, accounting, record keeping, things like that. Like I said before, the indirect cost rate is a percentage of the modified total direct cost, or MTDC. MTDC excludes equipment, capital expenditures, tuition, scholarships, participant support costs, and the portion of each subaward in excess of $50,000. Indirect costs higher than 15% of MTDC may be considered if already approved by another federal agency. If you do not have an established indirect cost rate with another federal agency, you may use 15% of the modified total direct cost. This 15% is called the de minimis rate. The percentage of indirect costs you don't use but are allowed, we call these unrecovered indirect costs, can be credited towards your match rate if needed. Here's an example of what a NICRA, or negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, typically looks like. A few things to ask yourself if you would like to include indirect costs in your budget. Make sure your budget narrative includes a breakdown of the eligible MTDC, modified total direct cost, and a calculation of the indirect costs based on your indirect rate. Check and see if you've included any expenses in the MTDC that are potentially excluded, like equipment, tuition, scholarships, stipends, and portions of subawards. Then, is your NICRA expired? Is the applicable indirect cost rate clearly identified in the NICRA? Getting out in front of these can facilitate the project review process. Here are some key takeaways from this video. First, construction and non-construction projects have different budget requirements. Second, please be consistent. Make sure your numbers are the same across all your documentation you include in the application: budget, forms, narrative, match letters, etc. Third, adhere to the requirements in the Uniform Guidance 2 CFR Part 200 related to your budget and procurement. Here is some contact information for ARC in case you may need it. If you have any follow-up questions or need further assistance, please reach out to us. Thank you for watching.